Welcome to another episode of Church and State with Brian McCall and Chris Ferrara, where periodically we get together to briefly discuss a couple of stories that have been relevant in politics, the deep church, and the deep state. So welcome again, Chris.
Well, thanks for having me back.
No, it's great.
What's on the list of topics today, Brian?
Well, we have several villains du jour, to use one of your favorite expressions. So we're going to first talk about there's a trial, as we're speaking, there's a trial going on in Wisconsin, and I think closing arguments are happening just right now as we speak. A young man, Kyle Rittenhouse, who was involved in the city of Kenosha when the riots were going on about over a year ago, last summer, the summer of carefully orchestrated riots.
Yep.
And the young
peaceful protests, Brian. Peaceful protests.
Well, your peaceful protest is my riot. You know, chaos is in the eye of the beholder.
That's right.
But anyway, this young man was there apparently at his employer's request to help kind of take care of some property that was being damaged, clean things up. He had a weapon with him. According to him, he was threatened and was threatened to be killed, was chased, and he defended himself. He sadly, and he's very sad about it, two people died as a result of his defense, and one was injured. So he immediately was charged. I mean, without really investigating any facts or talking to witnesses, put on trial. Was charged and is now on trial for the death of these individuals. He's obviously pleading self-defense. But it's really been a show trial, I think, in all the senses of that word. As I've been watching it, the entire case seems to be collapsing. I mean, the prosecutor's star witness basically got up and said, "Oh yeah, we were chasing the guy with a gun and we threatened to kill him. He was in self-defense." Which I don't know, Chris, your view, what's going on with this prosecutor? I mean, didn't you learn in law school you never put a witness on that you don't know what they're going to say?
Never ask a question that you don't know the answer
Yeah,
to. Well, at least in this case, that's a rule that should never be broken because, after all, it's your witness.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes you're in a situation where you have no chance to do discovery.
Right.
And you've got to ask the question in the hope of getting a good answer. So there's exceptions. There are exceptions to that rule,
Right.
but not in this case. That was their witness.
Right. Right.
That's almost as bad. It's probably even worse than having OJ try on the glove without knowing how that would come out.
Whether it would fit or not. Right. Well, again, there's just been some classic moments. I mean, one I like when this prosecutor was basically saying to the kid, "Do you play video games?" Well, he said, "I have. Would you ever play ones where you shoot people in the video game?" And he's like, "Well, yes, I've done that. I don't play a lot, but I play sometimes." And he says, "So you just want to violently kill everyone?" And the kid says, "Well, that's a game, and we're talking about real life." I mean, it's got to be embarrassing to be one-upped by a 18-year-old kid when you're
He's a very composed witness from what little I saw of him, except when he broke
Yes.
down on the witness stand during the first attempt to describe what happened.
Yes.
He's been well prepared by his defense attorney. He's doing a pretty darn good job, as far as I can tell. I haven't really followed it that much, though.
Yes.
I
Well-
find it excruciating.
Well, I find it entertaining, but it may be, I don't teach criminal procedure, but it would be a wonderful thing to show to students on how not to conduct a criminal trial.
If you're the prosecutor.
Yeah. But as you know, as much as it's fun to mock this, there are some serious issues really that have been brought up by this case, one of which I want to focus on to really show how it's a show trial in the negative sense of the sort of policing government, totalitarian government wanting to just basically say, we're going to punish you whatever we want and take away any semblance of law. So as many of our viewers know, one of the guarantees of the Constitution is that if you're accused of a crime, you have a right to remain silent. You have a right not to say anything. And flowing from that, or it would be a worthless right, there cannot be drawn any negative implications. So if you don't answer the question, you can't say, "Oh, that must mean that you're guilty," because you wouldn't answer the question. Now, this is not just an American principle. This goes all the way back to English law. St. Thomas More took advantage of it himself and just refused to answer questions. And they said, "Well, this means you don't agree with the king." He said, "Well, you can't prove that. I've said nothing." Right? So it's a very ancient principle. And I want to play a short clip because, again, you've litigated more than I, certainly more than I have. I was astounded at the reaction of this judge. Seems to be a pretty honest judge. Yeah,
Pretty sure.
because the prosecutor essentially tried to do this. He questioned him about his silence and its implications. So let's take a
That's
quick
almost
look.
as bad as
Oh,
mentioning insurance to the jury during a personal injury trial.
yes. Oh.
I did, or I indicated a bias towards denial is what I did. Held it open with a bias towards denial. Why would you think that that made it okay for you without any advance notice to bring this matter before the jury? I was astonished when you began your examination by commenting on the defendant's post-arrest silence. That's basic law. It's been basic law in this country for 40 years, 50 years. I have no idea why you would do something like that. And it gives, well, I'll leave it at that. So I don't know what you're up to.
May I respond?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there you have it. I mean, he's basically saying,
May I respond?
yeah.
May I respond? He violated the most basic canon of criminal law by introducing the defendant's silence. Although, by the way, I don't know if you follow any detective shows from England. Apparently, there's been a recent change in the law. Now they say to you, you have the right to remain silent. But if you don't offer something that you might use at trial in your defense now, you might be barred from using it. Apparently, there's some new variation on that thing. But in America, the right remains intact. In fact, I'm informed by one of our friends, the counselor Jamie Bogle, the barrister actually, that there are now exceptions even to double jeopardy under English law.
Wow.
You know that under Italian law, if you get acquitted, they take it to the appellate court and you're retried, you can be convicted.
So, like, we could just keep shooting at you until we hit you, basically.
Yeah, so you get to the highest court in Italy, and then maybe the conviction is reversed yet again. But no, he violated a basic canon. And if I had a judge that angry at me, I'd be shaking in my boots. I don't think I've ever seen a judge that angry.
Well, there's been some speculation on what's going on here that I've heard. I mean, the defense, in this case, they asked for a mistrial. And the judge has sort of been cagey. He hasn't really ruled on that or not. So maybe to explain, what is a mistrial? What are they asking for? And why might the judge, I mean, if this is such a basic, like, first-year law school principle that's been violated, why maybe is the judge not declaring a mistrial?
Well, there's a basis for a mistrial when you try to bring in the defendant's silence against him, violating his privilege against self-incrimination. He could have granted a mistrial on that basis, and it probably would have been well justified. But they're seeking something more. They want a mistrial with prejudice. I didn't know that was available under Wisconsin law. Not just a mistrial, but a mistrial with prejudice, because the prosecutorial conduct is so egregious. They should not be allowed to bring the case again. I don't think he's going to grant that, and I don't think he's going to grant a mistrial, the ordinary type of mistrial either. But that's certainly a basis for it. Once you bring that to the attention of the jury, then the corrective instruction isn't going to do any good. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you saw the pink elephant here, but I want you to ignore the presence of the pink elephant in the courtroom. There is no such thing in this courtroom. There is no pink elephant. Don't believe what you heard. Ignore what you heard. Those corrective instructions are of dubious value. So if he gets convicted of something, he might have a serious grounds for reversal on appeal. It's conceivable that the appellate panel could say the judge should have granted a mistrial. It depends, though, on what kind of corrective instruction he gives. He could avoid the error by giving in a sufficiently firm corrective instruction to the jury, which I'm sure he gave when he charged the jury. I wasn't watching it then, so I don't know what the jury charge was.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's happened yet. It may have happened just before we went on, but it will happen today. But no, it's interesting. It's very interesting because the case, again, is much larger than this young man, and hopefully this young man's life, won't be further ruined. I mean, he was involved in tragic events, involved in a riot, had his life threatened, but hopefully it won't be ruined further by him having to fit into the narrative of the deep state. That these
show.
Yes.
I mean, with the advent of the COVID regimes, we see also a development throughout the institutions of the politicization of everything.
Yes.
We have the politicization of the judiciary. I mean, everyone knows that liberals and conservatives alike have to resort to forum shopping. They have to carefully choose the forum in which they bring an action. That's just a fact. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. And the other issue is politicization, even in the institutions that are supposedly scientific and neutral in their advice to the people, such as the CDC, which is now obviously thoroughly politicized. You remember the incident where the teachers union complained to the CDC that they wanted school children in masks, and the very next day the CDC changed its guidance based on science to accommodate the lobbying of the teachers.
Right.
You can't trust anything these institutions are telling us anymore because everything is shot through with politics. I've never seen this bad in the history of my involvement in litigation.
Including the Justice Department and obviously prosecutors' offices.
Even the ACLU has protested the raid on, what's his name?
Veritas, Project Veritas.
Project Veritas.
Yes.
O'Keefe. Yes. The raid on O'Keefe. The ACLU finally came out with something in defense of civil liberties, as opposed to its normal course these past few years, which is the Anti-Civil Liberties Union. Yeah. And they said this is an over-the-top raid of a journalist with no showing that he had any connection to the theft of the diary, which theft, by the way, has not even been established. Apparently she left the diary somewhere. And since when does the Department of Justice investigate the theft of the president's niece's diary?
Right.
Are you kidding me?
Right.
So this is Banana Republic stuff. It's really quite frightening.
Well, it's frightening when the ACLU is agreeing with you. I mean, that's actually frightening.
They've discovered civil liberties again. It's quite remarkable.
Well, maybe even the Southern Poverty Law Center will actually get back to practicing law in defense of civil liberties. Well, I can't hope that far.
We can all be raided now.
Yes.
All we need is a pretext.
Yes.
And they'll be pounding your door down.
Yes. Well, in this theme, and talking about these sort of totalitarian techniques in the public sphere here in the United States, with the Rittenhouse Trial, also the trials that are about to begin of the so-called January 6th rioters or insurrectionists, we look to the church, and it's interesting, it's frightening to see the same kinds of techniques going on in the church. And first I want to draw to, there's been 2 letters issued this week about Traditionis Custodes, the brutal document of Francis, completely contradicting all of his recent predecessors, most directly his living predecessor, Benedict XVI. And what's interesting, wherever you stand on the Latin Mass, the viewers, whether you like the Latin Mass, go to it or not, you should at least have a common interest in sort of truth, reality, and history. And one of these letters is really just quite amazing. When I read it, it reminded me of the novel 1984 by George Orwell, who describes this sort of dystopian communist regime. And the main character, Winston Smith, his job in the Ministry of Truth is when the governing regime comes out with a new false narrative, a new made-up history, he has to go back through all the records, all the newspaper articles, and like literally cut out pictures of things, change the wording to conform to what the latest story is. And that's his job, is to fix history. So one line jumped out of this letter. Again, whatever you think about the Latin Mass, the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster asks and says, well, this new law, how does it relate to an indult granted to Cardinal Heenan in 1971? It's a fact that's been well known for 40 years. You can find copies of it in books, internet. It has an official protocol number. And a pretty undisputed fact from the Congregation of Divine Worship, whose current prefect on congregation letterhead writes the following. With regard to the indult given to Cardinal Heenan in November 1971, of which you write, we have searched our archives and found nothing that corresponds to this. But then he goes on, but in any event, even if it existed, it's gone. We're blowing it up. But again, he can't just say, well, we're just saying it's invalid. We've gotten rid of it. It's been superseded, which, again, would be problematic. But they have to go so far as to act as if it doesn't exist. It's gone, even though there's many people around the world with copies of it. I mean, where have we come when this is, you can't even believe a cardinal about a simple fact of a public letter?
Well, probably was disposed of at some point. But I have grave concerns now about what the priestly fraternity is going to do, not only in Rome, but elsewhere. I've talked to members of the fraternity, whose names will not be disclosed, who are assuming that at some point the fraternity will simply be dismembered along the lines of the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate. This Pope has every intention, if he can get away with it, of extinguishing the Latin Mass movement in the Church and the very existence of the received and approved rite of Mass in the Church, whose canon can be traced back to apostolic times. Absolutely unbelievable hubris of this man who thinks he can get away with this. He won't get away with it. He will not prevail, because this is of God, not of men. The traditional liturgy cannot be eradicated, as much as he will try to do so. So I think ultimately it's going to backfire. But the immediate concern is what's going to happen in Rome this coming Easter, with the fraternity forbidden to offer the Triduum in the traditional manner. What are they going to do?
Yes, so the Cardinal Vicar, who speaks for the name of the Pope as Bishop of Rome, the title Francis loves the most, Bishop of Rome, has decreed, as Chris said, in Rome, that even the Fraternity of St. Peter cannot offer the Triduum, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, the Easter Vigil, in Rome, with the books that they were created as an institution to offer. And the irony of this, the same place, they were granted just a couple years ago a right to not even use the 1962 missal, but to go back to the pre-Pius XII. So we talk about a reversal. It's astounding. Beyond that, the same letter says they're not even allowed to administer the sacraments. They can only offer Mass throughout the year. I mean, how can a priest or a parish function by just offering Mass and not administering the corresponding sacraments?
Well, it can't. That's the idea. So what we have here is another example of the dictator Pope at work, who constantly denounces rigidity in others and lack of flexibility, lack of dialogue and openness to the other, when he is the most rigid, inflexible, intolerant Pope living memory. I've never seen anything like this fellow. If we have to refer to him at all as the Vicar of Christ, which he refuses to use, the title he refuses to use, by the way. I've never seen anything like this in all the time I've been following papal affairs. He is simply acting as if he were the dictator of a banana republic. Whatever he wants to do, he will do. He thinks he can actually order the destruction of the traditional Roman liturgy. He actually thinks he can do this.
Well, I had an idea, actually, for this parish, what they might be able to do. So I think of all the people that normally go there, go out and get divorced and get civilly remarried, then show back up, they might say, well, in order to accompany me on the path back, I think I need to go to this Mass of the Triduum. So in all the facts and circumstances here, could you make an exception to the rule? I mean, I think that might actually be effective with this Pope.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if he's targeting the celebration of the traditional Christmas in Rome itself,
yes.
The church. And of course, he's banned the traditional Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. I think it's confined to one location in the crypt somewhere, and only on certain days of the week. He's banned it in the Basilica of St. Peter. Now he's banning the Easter Triduum in Rome. Who knows what the Congregation for Divine Worship of the Sacraments and the Congregation for Institutes of Apostolic Life and Consecrated Life have in store for the Latin Mass communities in general throughout the Church. It's obvious they have a blueprint for their extermination. That's why he gave competency to those two dicasteries for the implementation of his order to destroy the Roman liturgy, which is what it really is.
Well, and again, the hypocrisy, as we've both pointed out here, is this is the Pope who, as I facetiously just said, is perfectly happy to give the go-ahead for public sinners to receive the sacraments. Purportedly told, as we talked about last time, the most pro-abortionist person in the White House we've ever had, Joe Biden, he's a great Catholic and should keep going to communion. When bishops in his own country have begun to suggest that this may be a problem. So it's okay for abortionists to receive the sacraments, but some Italians who are attached to the form of sacraments as they existed for 2,000 years, they must be stopped at all costs.
Well, we see a parallel development here. We see in civil society, and this is, after all, a show entitled Church and State.
Yes.
A total breakdown in the normal functioning of legal processes.
Yes.
So in the state, we see health commissioners or governors issuing decrees with a flick of the pen that extinguish fundamental rights on the pretext of a virus. This is unheard of. And so all legal processes are suspended by a dictate of the administrative state. And when you go to court to challenge these things, you often encounter judges who say, I will not second guess science, even though there really is no science behind most of this nonsense. And then in the church, we see the same thing. This Pope is fracturing the framework of tradition in the church, whereby we accept what has been handed down to us, in this case, the received and approved rite of Mass in the Western Church. He simply thinks that he can do away with these things, again, with the flick of a pen. So the parallel development in church and state is a complete breakdown in law. And the result is a state of anomy or lawlessness in both societies. And the chaos that is reigning in both is obvious to anyone who's following affairs in church and state, which this show attempts to do. We've never seen anything quite like this. Even during the worst period of the post-conciliar epoch, we never saw anything like this.
Well, and the root cause of its breakdown both places, as you've documented in your book, Liberty, the God That Fails, is the false liberal notion of liberty. Because it sounds like, oh, it's going to give you a lot of protection, liberty, it's going to keep you safe, but really just as an excuse for dictators and totalitarians to take away your liberty.
Well, that's the paradox. The paradox of, well, among other things, representative government.
Yes.
Well, your representative has agreed to this, so how can you possibly complain about the outcome? And the principle of representation, even that now has been superseded. Our elected representatives are no longer consulted by the administrative state. They just issue a dictate. Close your business. Put a mask on your face. Put 2 masks on your face. Have an injection. Have 2 injections. Have 3 injections. And if you don't obey, you lose your livelihood. You know, our only refuge now is the federal judiciary, and more specifically, depending upon the circuit, judges appointed by certain presidents as opposed to other presidents. That's the way it's shaking out. It's obvious that the liberals know this. That's why they pick the judicial circuits that they do to initiate their challenges or to set aside measures that would vindicate your civil rights and your constitutional rights. So right now they're engaged in challenging the Texas law, and you know, that was a forum that didn't bode well for them. So we'll see how that comes out. But that's the situation we're in. Chaos at all levels. Our last refuge appears to be the federal judiciary. And there we get to the Supreme Court with a very slim majority, depending on the case, too.
Well, and the certain chameleon justices, who knows who they'll become next time.
Well, we don't know what the outcome will be.
Yes.
I mean, we do have a conservative majority, but they have to act, because if they don't act, then it's the deluge.
Yes.
And we'll have a situation in which bureaucrats, health officials, governors, what have you, without any legislative process, without any checks or balances whatsoever, and just issue dictates, as long as they label them emergency dictates. Right. So government by emergency. An emergency that, as Justice Gorsuch rightly notes, has to end sometime.
Well, but it started 2 years ago and could go on, according to the CDC, for years and actually never go away. So an emergency that's always a perpetual emergency seems to be their current standard.
Well, I don't know how we're going to recover the proper functioning of law and order in church and state.
Yeah.
We've reached a situation where I don't see a clear path out of it right now. And many people are talking about how this could be basically a terminal situation, at least for civil society. You know, the church will never be conquered entirely, because the gates of hell will not prevail against it. But in civil society, we're seeing a complete collapse of law and order. And Benedict noted this in one of his addresses as Pope. When he said the structures that seem to be erected for the defense of what is right and just are collapsing for lack of consensus.
Yes.
And he says it appears that the end of civilization is at hand. This is Benedict speaking. So that's a return of the preconciliar pessimism of the popes about political modernity.
Sounds like a prophet of doom and gloom and doom. Yes. Well, in any event, we should end by noting we don't point out these things, this collapse, to just tell everybody you should wring your hands and run and hide under your bed, but to turn to Our Lady of Fatima, right? Because we know she is our only hope. She is been given to us, as she told us, as the last refuge. So we don't need to listen to these things and panic or think, humanly speaking, it's hopeless. But if we have the Queen of Heaven, she's given us a peace plan that could fix all of this. And we just we can't do it all ourselves, but we can do our part. Observe the 5 first Saturdays, pray the rosary, do penance, and do reparation to her Immaculate Heart.
And never forget that Christ is the Lord of history. And,
Yes.
and in the end, God will mock these nations and bring them
Yes.
to nothing. And also remember what Our Lady of Good Success said, that when it seems most hopeless, when the situation is deteriorated to the point when humanly speaking, it seems impossible to rectify it, that will actually be the beginning of the Great Restoration.
Yes. Well, may it come soon. Thank you all for listening. And again, join us next time, and we'll discuss a couple of pressing news items reflecting the unheard of unity that we're really seeing between the deep church and the deep state, between church and state, moving along this path, same methods as we've been talking about. So continue to pray for that triumph of the Immaculate Heart. May God bless you. We'll see you next time.